everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today's session is called the Egregore in the Room. And today we have Ray Doraisamy with us. He's a curious person I found on Twitter. He was writing about egregores. I was really getting into them for a moment, and he had this cool blog post on it. And I read it. I reached out to him and asked him if he wanted to come to the Stoa and do a session, and he agreed. So we're here. I'm going to tag in Ray in a moment, and he's going to do a slide presentation for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll stop the record button and we'll have kind of an organic conversation here at the Stoa. So that being said, I will tag Ray in. Welcome to the Stoa, my friend.
Hi. I'm glad to see everyone. Let's see if I can get this screen shared. And if everyone can see that, I'm gonna begin. So I was a 11-year-old when this happened in a Muslim country. And I didn't have the ability to quite understand why everyone around me was reacting the way they were. I lived in a area that was extremely multicultural, while still being a Muslim country, and in a small Christian enclave. One of the pastors that my family knew was killed um, by a group of Muslims with machetes. And it was all very confusing to me at the time. Um, I didn't understand why people that we got along so well with, seemingly before this moment, seemed to change what they were saying. And around the same time, my parents started to insinuate that maybe I was demonically influenced. Um, that my questioning of what they were teaching me was something that was pushed by evil spirits and demons. And it was, again, very confusing to me why someone would think that, why my parents would treat me in that way, and why my community would treat me in that way. Um, so I retreated into books a lot. I became a bit of an introvert while still intensely paying attention to everyone around me, because I couldn't quite predict their behavior or why they would do what they would do. Um, if I thought about it as them being malicious, that didn't quite make sense, because this was my community. These were my parents, and they were becoming very adamant about what I should believe and what questions I should ask and what questions I shouldn't ask. That time was a very tumultuous time. I went from having servants in a household uh, to basically my family was relying on others in order to feed me. So there was a lot of change. Um, and with that change came a lot of change in beliefs. So that country was Malaysia, and that's a statue of Murugan, which is a Hindu god. And my grandmother was a worshiper of this god. And my parents took some more hostile positions in that time toward her for her beliefs. And this was a similar community that both had Hindus and Buddhists, all in the same country, all often in the same street, in the same neighborhood, ostensibly working together. But now there was this underlying divide, pressured by global change. And it was all very confusing to me. I turned atheist, which was quite painful in its way. And I started to cycle through various belief systems and value systems over time. I moved out of that area to the United States. And when that happened, I was desperately looking for something to believe in. And when that was lacking, I turned to politics. I started getting really involved with the local Democrats, with the local feminists, stuff like that. And it still didn't quite satisfy me in the way that I remember Christianity satisfying me when I was a child, before I stopped believing. And so I spent the next 10 years after that cycling through beliefs and value systems, losing value systems over and over again, and not quite understanding why I was doing that. Because every time you lose your faith, every time you lose your belief system, every time you lose your way of figuring out where you are in the world, it's a painful process. So it was very confusing to me why I would do that. It was very confusing to me why people around me would often judge each other for their beliefs. Why so much of discourse had this adversarial quality to it. Why that seemed to be going up and up like a volcano building pressure. Um, and now that seems to be getting more extreme. So I was confused. Like I didn't understand people, it seemed like, and I didn't understand myself. I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing. None of it made sense from a logical point of view. As I started to study more formal logic and statistics and things like that, and coming across biases 10 years ago, none of it seemed to make sense from a rational point of view. Um, until I started looking at people from the point of view of the group as opposed to the individual. Even though I was raised elsewhere, I was still raised in some ways in a Western context, and that context is very individualist. So every action that we engage in is often viewed through an individual lens. All these decisions that people were making around me, all these decisions that I was making, didn't quite make sense to me from that point of view. It often does not make sense to pick fights with your neighbors or to argue with them or to judge them in any way, because the moment you start judging someone else, I found at least, you start judging yourself. And that was all very confusing to me. I've got a friend named Anna, and one of her favorite things to say is, "You are not so special." And so I kind of started a journey down that point of view of maybe humans aren't so special. Uh, Maybe we live in ecosystems just like all other life. And like all other life, there are patterns of behavior that we engage in that serve what we are a part of rather than ourselves directly. So I started looking at trees and noticing that the research at the time, one of the exciting things about that research was noticing the collective behavior of trees in old growth forests. You might have been introduced to this perhaps in the book The Hidden Life of Trees, which really goes over this a lot. Naturally, I started seeing it in swarms, in flocks of birds, or schools of fish, where animals following seemingly simple rules started to engage in behavior where you think they are coordinating in some clear way that would be similar to how we coordinate uh, a bus route or something like that. But it turns out that simple rules can predict how they're coordinating, and they're clearly not communicating in a abstract way like we are. I came across quorum sensing in bees. Uh, this practice of how bees make decisions about what hive to select when they move hives. It turns out they have scout bees that are much more experienced forager bees that go out to various locations and look for new hive settings. And when they find a hive setting that is appropriate, they go back to their hive and they start dancing vigorously. And the hive selects the location whose foragers, whose scouts came back and danced the hardest at the highest numbers. And this started to look fairly similar to me to something else I'd read about people actually in crowds in New York City during a New Year's celebration. And that introduced me to the work of Randall Collins, who looks at how situation dynamics in large groups of people drives behavior. He calls it interaction ritual chains. And this same behavior occurs in ants, quorum sensing. Though there's slightly less information on that out there, it does appear to follow the same pattern. Fish, same thing. Uh, the other cool thing about fish to me was noticing some research about the status hierarchy of males in some fish, where the bottom of the hierarchy and the top of the hierarchy tend to have similar patterns of behavior to contrast with the fish in the middle of the hierarchy. And that seemed very similar to me to my experiences growing up in groups of boys, where the people on the bottom and the people on the top are kind of fighting all the time in some way. They're engaging in some sort of conflict. Sometimes you're wrestling behind class, and other times you're just insulting each other, but there's some sort of similarity there. And then there's a group that kind of skates by in the middle. Sometimes they become the bullies. And you see a similar pattern in fish. So you have crowds, and there's clearly something that happens in crowds to change the behavior of the people in them. I remember the first time I experienced this was during a World Cup. I did not go to the location of the World Cup, but the World Cup's really big in Malaysia. And so people took to the streets, even though, you were just watching something on a screen uh, in a place very far away. But that crowd had a life of its own, and it seemed to enter me. Now we see this kind of thing in protests everywhere. The theory of interactual ritual chains uh, generally predicts violence using a similar means to predicting swarm behavior in other animals. There's also something called gelation theory, which does the same thing for extremist groups. So these, combined with looking at cultural evolution, showed me that maybe I was looking at people all wrong, in the sense that there are aspects to our behavior, there are aspects to my behavior, there are aspects to the behavior of people around me that were better explained from the point of view of the group, from the point of view of the collective, from the point of view of the ecosystem that we're in. I most recently came across this article, which really resonated with me because I've kind of always felt like I was a visitor to my own society, to human society. And most recently, I've found the opposite, that I'm feeling like I'm finally belonging, like I'm finally a part of things. And I was beginning to wonder if it's because I've spent so much time doing things like tracking the number of emotional bids in my relationships, paying attention to people very closely, uh, just basically being really obsessed with how we interact as a species. And it's interesting because this article is about a guy who uh, visited this octopus every day for a year or so, and they made a documentary about it. And he talks about how he felt like a visitor until he started realizing the language that the creatures that he was studying seemed to be talking in, how they were communicating. And that gave him something of a sense of belonging, which brought me to another phenomena, which I was on a walk a couple weeks ago, and there was a crow, and that crow was mobbing this kestrel. I didn't know at the time that that was what that was called. It's when a crow rises above a bird of prey and constantly kind of bothers it, pecks at it, and it was very confusing because I couldn't understand why a crow would do this to another bird alone. It seemed to be very expensive as a behavior. And then as I learned about that, because it was bothering me, like trying to figure out why this crow was doing what it was doing, I found out that it's most likely that the crow is doing it to signal fitness of the group and with the group. So this behavior that makes no sense in terms of an individual crow makes sense if you consider that the crow is both defending the group for the group, as well as showing the rest of the group its own strength so that the group can figure out who to select for what later on. And down that road, I started learning about uh, observing birds a little bit more. And this this way of looking at animals I've found is actually really useful for looking at us as human beings, at looking at how we make the decisions that we do, at looking at our own feelings, at looking at my own pain, at looking at my own alienation. Because oftentimes I find that we use a lot of selective attention where we're fixated on a specific goal, on a specific target. And as a result of that, we have a hard time interacting with the other parts of ourselves that might have other things going on. And so, this method of looking at an ecosystem more broadly, in this case for birds, is actually applicable for looking at ourselves and the people we interact with. So that when you address a feeling within yourself, it's not necessarily something like, why am I feeling this thing? Say I feel some sort of jealousy at someone for getting the recognition that I did not get, or something like that. Instead of asking, why am I feeling this thing that I'm not supposed to feel because it's a wrong feeling to have? I might take a look at it and be like, oh, what purpose is this serving? It must serve some sort of purpose since it's here, this thought. Um, how is it helping the group that I'm a part of? And I find that in addressing these feelings that way, it's much more easy for me to interact with myself, which then makes it much more easy for me to interact with the people around me, because then I can see when they are engaged in similar patterns. And that's part of this paragraph over here. I'm just going to read it. Although we can see in only one direction at a time, when we're in bird language mode, we're hearing information from all directions all the time. The experience, the experience is multidimensional and involves many different senses. We're walking carefully, slowly, stopping and looking, but not sneaking, which fools no one out there. Adopting a relaxed body posture that reflects a relaxed, receptive brain and not a hunting brain. And I contrasted the diffuse attention with the selective attention earlier, because I think selective attention oftentimes comes from looking at things from an individual point of view. Whereas when you look at things from a group point of view, it's much more easy to use some sort of diffuse attention. You can think of selective attention as a spotlight and diffuse attention as an ambient sunlight. So today, I'd like to kind of take a look at the egregores in the room. If any of you feel comfortable enough to share with me, um, so that we can get an idea for what parts of ourselves might be motivated by group motivations rather than individual motivations. At the moment, I don't have a completely relaxed and open way of doing this. Uh, I would say it's the equivalent of beating a bush to get some birds out rather than calmly walking around and observing. Um, and so we come to these questions, which again, they are a little rough, uh, which is why I'd only ask you all to share if you're comfortable. So that should mark the end of the presentation, and we can go into discussion.
All right. So I put the questions in the chat. Is it cool if I stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
And Ray and I decided to just turn off the recording now so we can have a more free dialogue. So I'll turn that off now.